listen closely. There was a time when Africa's lands were whole. Kingdoms stood tall like mountains. Rivers carried stories, and the people walked proud, free, and unbroken. But everything changed when strangers from across the sea came with hungry eyes. They did not come to learn. They did not come to share. They came to take. The world was about to be cut apart like cloth on a market table. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. In those days, many European countries had already taken lands in the Americas and Asia. Their leaders began to ask, what of Africa? What treasures wait there? They were not thinking of friendship. They were thinking of gold, land, and power. Africa had what they wanted, and they decided they would not live without it. But Africa was not empty. Its people had kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, Benin, Oyo, Congo, Ethiopia, and many others. These nations had leaders, armies, trade routes, and culture deeper than the roots of a 1,000-year-old tree. Still, Europe believed that power belonged to whoever took it first. The storm was coming. And Africa did not yet know how heavy the clouds would become. The earliest Europeans arrived on African shores as traders. They asked for gold, ivory, spices, and sometimes cloth. African kingdoms agreed to trade because trade was normal, and peace brought wealth to both sides. But over time, something darker entered the exchange: people. Europeans began to buy and capture African men, women, and children to be enslaved across the seas. At first, some African leaders thought they could control the trade. They believed it would end one day. They believed Europe's appetite had limits. But they were wrong. The hunger only grew. Entire villages disappeared. Kingdoms fought neighbors for survival. Families cried for loved ones who never returned. Europe was mapping Africa, not as a home, but as a marketplace of human lives. Years passed. Africa grew weaker, not because its spirit broke, but because the chains grew too heavy. While Africa struggled to heal, Europe grew stronger, richer, powerful. Soon, European kings and rulers looked at a map of Africa and felt no shame. They pointed at rivers, lands, forests, and mountains none of them had ever seen and said, "This will be mine." Africa did not know it yet, but the ground beneath it was shifting. The scramble had begun. The year was 1884. Many powerful European leaders gathered in Berlin, Germany. They sat around a large table with a giant map of Africa spread before them. But not one single African leader was invited. Nations were being discussed, divided, and taken, without Africa even hearing the conversation. This meeting became known as the Berlin Conference. Each European country argued over who would get which land. Britain wanted the East and the South. France wanted the West and the North. Belgium, a small country, claimed the Congo, the very heart of Africa, as if it were a toy. Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy all took pieces too. They drew straight lines across the land, lines that ignored tribes, kingdoms, cultures, languages, and history. The map of Africa was being rewritten like a story someone stole and changed the ending of. They spoke of civilizing Africa. But what they truly wanted was control. They hid their greed beneath fancy words like a progress and order. And when they were finished, they looked at the new map and smiled. But this was not a smile of peace. It was the smile of wolves who had found a feast. Africa did not choose the fate that was coming, it was chosen for them. After the Berlin Conference, European ships filled with soldiers, guns, and flags came rushing to Africa like waves in a storm. They did not ask for welcome. They claimed land by force. Villages that once lived in peace woke to the sound of gunfire. Kingdoms that had stood strong for centuries were now facing armies with weapons they had never seen before. Some African leaders tried to fight. Like the mighty Zulu, led by kings whose courage was like fire. Like Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II, who defeated the Italians in the Battle of Odwa. Like the Asante of Ghana, who rose again and again to defend their land. Like the people of Dahomey, whose women warriors fought with unmatched bravery. But war after war weakened the land. Some leaders were captured. Others were killed. And some were tricked with papers written in languages they could not read. Papers that claimed they had signed away their land. Europe built borders, lines that said, these people belong here. Those belong there. Families were separated. Tribes were broken. Enemies were forced to live together. Friends were torn apart. The map was drawn. But the heart of Africa was bleeding. With control of the land, Europe now wanted its wealth. They forced Africans to work on farms, in mines, and along railroads. They took rubber from Congo, gold from South Africa, cocoa from Ghana, diamonds from Sierra Leone, and countless other treasures from the soil. They controlled every crop, every road, every hand that worked the fields. In return, Africa received nothing but pain. Children grew up in labor camps. Villages lost their young men to endless work. Women cried as the land that once fed them now served another master. But still, Africa remembered who it was. In stories whispered at night. In songs sung by mothers. In dances that kept history alive. The spirit of Africa refused to die. Even under the weight of chains, the flame of identity stayed burning. And slowly, that flame grew. Because chains break. Empires fall. And no matter how long the night is, morning always comes. But even as Europe controlled the lands, something was changing. Whispers of resistance began to grow like seeds under the soil. Africans started to ask questions, not in fear, but in awakening. Why should we work for another? Why should our names, languages, and stories be hidden? Why should we bow to rulers who do not know our rivers, our mountains, our ancestors? Schools were opened by Europeans, hoping to teach Africans to obey. But those schools did something unexpected. They opened minds. Young Africans learned to read and write in new languages. They began to understand the world outside their villages. They began to understand power. And once a mind wakes up, it cannot be shut again. Leaders began to rise. People who could speak to crowds. People who could write letters. People who could argue with laws. People who could say, this is our land. It was taken. And it must return. These voices spread across Africa. Some called for peace. Some called for protest. Some prepared for war. The world was changing, and Africa was no longer silent. The chains were still there, but they were cracking. A new fire was growing. The first great wave of resistance swept across West Africa. In Ghana, a man named Kwame Nkrumah spoke to crowds, saying, Africa must rise. He believed that freedom was not a dream but a right. He organized groups, meetings, and movements. The British rulers tried to silence him, but his voice grew louder. In Nigeria, leaders from different tribes, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, began to speak of unity. They argued, they disagreed, but they all knew one thing: the land must be free again. In Senegal and Mali, men and women marched through streets demanding schools, jobs, and dignity. In Kenya, the Mau Mau fighters took to the forest to battle for their soil. In Algeria, a long, fierce war erupted to break away from French rule. Africa was rising not as one voice, but as many, strong, stubborn, unbroken voices. And Europe felt the pressure. The world was watching. The age of empires was fading. The cost of holding Africa was growing too high. The winds of freedom were blowing, slow, steady, unstoppable. The land remembered itself. And Africa began to breathe again. Freedom did not come all at once. It came like rain, first one drop, then another, then suddenly the clouds broke. One by one, African nations declared independence. Ghana in 1957. Nigeria in 1960. Senegal, Congo, Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya, and many more. Flags changed. New anthems were sung. Streets filled with dance, music, and celebration. But independence did not erase the lines that Europe drew. The borders remained. Tribes that had once lived together were now separated into different countries. People who had once been one family were told they were now strangers. Old tensions rose. Some nations struggled to find unity. Some leaders became kind. Some became cruel. Europe had taken the treasure of the land, but the deepest treasure, the heart and spirit of Africa, survived. Now Africa faced a new challenge, healing itself. Rebuilding villages, cities, schools, and trust. Teaching children who they were before the world tried to rename them. Remembering the songs, dances, stories, and beliefs that colonialism tried to erase. The story was no longer about being taken. It was about becoming whole again. But healing is hard. And some wounds were deep. In some regions, conflict erupted. In others, governments struggled to guide their nations. Some leaders wanted power more than peace. Some countries were pushed into debt by foreign nations who still wanted control, even without direct rule. Yet, even through struggle, Africa continued to rise. New writers told old stories. New singers carried ancient rhythms. New nations built schools, universities, and roads. A new generation was born, one that had never seen chains but lived with the memory of them. This generation began to ask new questions. Who are we now? What do we want to become? How do we heal from what was taken? Africa looked forward, not forgetting the past, but learning from it. The land that had been split apart was slowly finding its way back to itself. The story was not finished. It was still being written. Today, when you look at the map of Africa, you still see those straight lines that Europe drew long ago. But inside those lines are people who survived everything. People whose ancestors refused to let their identity die. People who still sing to the earth, honor their ancestors, and dance with the sun. Africa is rising again, not to return to the past, but to shape its own future. A future written by African voices, African hands, and African hearts. The story of Africa is not a story of defeat. It is a story of endurance, memory, and return. The story you have just heard is a reminder, even when the world tries to divide you, your spirit can remain whole. If you were living in that time, would you fight? Would you speak? Would you lead? I want to know your opinion, because every story is like a candle that can light the path for someone else.